Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. Thank you so much for coming. Really wonderful to see you all here. To get us started, I'm delighted to welcome Colin Hunter, who's going to give us a welcome to country on Wurundjeri land here. So please welcome Colin.
Thank you very much. Good evening and welcome. It is my honour and privilege to be here today. My name is Colin Hunter IV. I would like to start off with acknowledging that this evening we are on Wurundjeri country, home of my ancestors and also home to everybody here today. I wish to pay my respects to both elders past, present and emerging, elders from all nations, especially all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community members joining us here tonight. Wurundjeri is a part of the Kulin Nation and of the Warong language group. Wurundjeri country extends from the inner city of Melbourne, across to the Great Dividing Range, west to the Werribee River, south to the Mordialloc Creek, and east to Mount Baw Baw. A big thank you to everybody who has helped make this event possible this evening. Wominjeka, welcome, and I hope everybody has a fantastic night ahead. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks, Colin. And Colin has to be in Sunbury at 7 a.m. in the morning, so we thank you for that really warm welcome, Colin. And I'm really excited about the developments on this country. We've got an amazing First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, which is kind of voice. We've got the Uruk Justice Commission, which has been looking into past and ongoing violations against First Peoples. Truth and treaty negotiations are pretty much underway between the state and the First Peoples Assembly, and so it's great to see Victoria leading the way on First Peoples issues, and a lot of that happening here on Wurundjeri country. So look, it's wonderful to be here tonight. Thank you so much for coming. I know that you are all here to see Sandrine, so I'll be very brief, but just to introduce you to CPD, the Centre for Policy Development. We're really delighted to be one of the hosts tonight. And our mission really is a fair, sustainable and thriving society and wellbeing economy in Australia and Southeast Asia. And our vision really is to help create transformative systems change through practical solutions to complex policy challenges. And so we tackle these hard questions, working towards change that is systemic and long run. Our motto, which I love, is create, connect, convince. So we create those policy ideas that are in the best interests of Australia and the region. We connect people around those ideas, whether that's federal government, state government, local government, private sector, civil society, and convince. We work with government and to convince them to implement those policy ideas. And we've got sort of four big focus areas that we work on in a new 3-year strategy. One is around just transitions. So this is ensuring that no one's left behind in the transition to a net zero economy. We've got a focus area on wellbeing government, and this is how we can really ensure that our policies are made that are going to be fit for purpose for current and future generations. We've got a social services focus area, which is really looking at how we can transform the way that social services are delivered in this country, from employment services to early childhood education and more. And then our last focus area is on forced migration, really working with refugees and people fleeing violence in Southeast Asia and ensuring that they receive better protection. And so you'll see a huge overlap between those four focus areas and what Sandrine's going to be talking about tonight in her 5 big turnarounds. It's almost like we invited her here to Australia to speak about these topics. So, those turnarounds like transforming energy systems, just transitions, wellbeing economy, reducing inequality, empowerment, they're all really, the key issues of our day. And Sandrine really is able to talk about them in an incredibly eloquent and clear way. And so that is why we were delighted to partner with ANU, with the Next Economy, with the Club of Rome and Earth for All and Sharan Burrow to bring Sandrine here to Australia to really show how these issues relate and how ambitious policy and systems change is possible. To introduce Sandrine, I'm delighted that Zoe Whitten's going to join us to introduce Sandrine. Zoe is CPD's new board chair, but also managing director and head of strategy and impact at Pollination, and really a leading expert on climate finance and advising investors on how to manage climate risk, and has worked at many of the leading banks around the world. So, Zoe, we're delighted that you're now our chair, and thanks for introducing Sandrine.
Thanks so much. I'm also delighted. I'm delighted that you're all here. I'm delighted that we're having this conversation. Sandrine tells me that she likes difficult conversations, so I think that you've got the right speaker for this evening. So you'll indulge me for just a couple of minutes while I introduce her, because there's a bit to say. Sandrine is officially the co-president of the Club of Rome, and in that function with her co-chair, or her co-president, they are both the first women to hold that role. But she's also the executive chair of the Club of Rome program Earth for All, which we're going to hear quite a bit about this evening. She sits on the boards, I know will be relevant for some of us, of a number of organisations that you might recognise, like BMW and the OECD, and Climate Kick, organisation well known to a lot of people here, and Imperial College London. And she teaches at the College of Europe in Bruges in Belgium. She also supports the Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership in their work as faculty. And she's a TED Global speaker and an author besides. She's recognised by Reuters in the 25 Female Trailblazers of 2023, and she's on a whole bunch of other very exciting award lists as well. But she's got a lot to say to you all tonight. And CPD, we're really delighted to host her here, along with the list of organisations that Andrew's outlined. So Sandrine's going to talk a bit about a few elephants in the room and blind spots, which I think will be a productive discussion, and then a few futures and paths, and as Andrew said, these big breakthroughs or these turnarounds that we might need to see in front of us. But really, what we're trying to do here in this conversation, and as we always are with CPD, is bridge these paradigms, the different paradigms we have to bring together in order to get systems change, and Sandrine is the right person to do that. So I will only say to all of that the context that we are sitting in here is that we, the Club of Rome, published the Limits to Growth slightly over 50 years ago. It was old when I started my career. And we were clearly outside of said limits at that time, and we continue to be so today, so at least we're consistent. The Earth for All work came out of the anniversary, that 50th year anniversary. And last week, as we have this conversation, UNEP has reminded us that we are running out of time. We have a couple of years left before we get beyond our 1.5 degree world. And at the same time, unfortunately, when I now scroll through my FT newsfeed or my Bloomberg newsfeed, there's a whole section dedicated to live war zones, which wasn't the case when I started my career. When I joined the UNFCCC as a 21-year-old, which was long a time ago, but actually not that long ago, we were already worried and impatient then. And there's been some sliding since we were in those rooms and having those conversations. History, it turns out, didn't end. But we've also seen some fantastic progress. In the audience is CT, who is joining us from ANZ, and I say that because when I joined Bank of America and Merrill Lynch, slightly over 15 years ago in London, one of my career coaches said to me, well, you could have done something different with the world and you could have actually changed it, but now you're here. And that was the view of finance at that time. And since that time, we now have financial institutions across the world, including ANZ and many of the peers globally, committed to net zero, which at that point in time wasn't something we could even imagine might have happened. So we are seeing progress. We have a handful of days to go until the US election, and it feels like our future could go in a number of ways. There are hard paths, and there are much better paths. And so, Sandrine, my ask to you is to tell us how we get on those better paths and avoid the hard ones.
Well, that's quite a challenge, isn't it, Zoe? And first of all, let me say my thank yous, but also say how lovely it is to be introduced by Zoe. You may not know, but actually my eldest daughter's name is Zoe. And we chose that name because it means life. So I am hopeful. And I think there's an echo because I think both of my mics are working. So what I might do is move around, if I may, because I actually am more of a mover than I am someone who's going to stay behind the lectern. I want to, first of all, thank Catherine Treeback, Next Economy, and definitely CBD for the incredible welcome that I've had, but also Sharan, Burrow, and everyone. So I've actually started my Australia trip in Canberra, and now I'm here, and I will continue on to Perth. I want to also try to honor what Zoe has asked me to do, but I am going to bring in a bit of a reality check as well, because I think that's important. It's not possible to think about the way forward if we don't understand why we've created the problems that we've created. And we do need to understand in the limits to growth, the way in which we got to where we are. The scenarios in the limits to growth, which actually you can see right here, and I know it's quite small, but let me just describe it a little bit for you. That actually industrial output would already start to drop. Economic throughput would start to drop in the 2020s. That we would see an increase in social tipping points, in a demand for land, and in the difficulty in actually being able to continue to use the land in the way that we did because of soil depletion, et cetera. So what's extraordinary in the limits to growth is the fact that actually, take my scarf off? There we go. Is that better? Wonderful. What we saw in the limits to growth was already then the messaging that we would start to have severe social and environmental tipping points at this time. And you can see through all of the major shifts that actually started in the 1970s around the increase in carbon dioxide. In fact, in the limits to growth, we already saw predictions that we would be at 450 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, which we are now. Remember, this was published in 1972. But also population growth, NOx. We did see an increase in real GDP. But what we're starting to see now is, for example, real GDP is decreasing in many parts of the world. So how are we able to turn that around? And I fundamentally believe that the only way to start to do that is to figure out what are the key elephants in the room. And to really look at those elephants full on and to have those difficult conversations and to start to shift. So one is CO2 responsibility. Who bears the core of that responsibility? The continued extractive economy, which is based on GDP growth and productivity. By the way, it came out straight out of the war with the Bretton Woods institutions, based on the fact that, yes, we did need to rebuild. But now we're in a very different type of economy where we don't necessarily need to rebuild. We need to reduce our consumption. We need to look at other indicators that can be part of the real economy. And we need to get away from what we call the over-financialized economy, where actually shareholder premise is what determines our economy more than anything else. So we need to understand that not only is there that sense of responsibility, but as you will see, there will also be, how do we deal with wealth and the wealthiest? How do we actually look at real distribution of wealth in order to move forward? And how do we start to truly look at our consumption emissions and the impacts that we're having, not only within our own countries, but outside of those countries? So you can see here, obviously, the share of consumption-based CO2 emissions. But let's link that then to, as I said, the wealthy. The elephant in the room is not the fact that we understand it is necessary to have an economy that fosters positive well-being for most people. It's the fact that we've gone to such extreme wealth and growing poverty that is continuing. It's the gap between the two of those that's continuing to be the problem. Within country, wealth distribution has been moving in the wrong direction, not in the right direction. And we were told that with GDP growth, trickle down would work. Well, we know that that has not been the case. So the richest 1% have gained about 63% of the new wealth created between 20 and 21, and this is actually growing, even post-COVID. And the poorest 50% are taking less than 15% of the earnings. So CO2 responsibility is one key elephant in the room. The wealthy is another key elephant in the room. Not all, but those that are not accepting their sense of responsibility for how to actually properly redistribute. And that comes into discussions around wealth taxation and also, in particular, windfall profits, 2.8 billion per day of oil and gas windfall profits that are not being taxed on the back of energy poverty. But the other key elephant in the room is the cost of inaction. So CO2 responsibility, growing wealthy, and then the cost of inaction, which is the fact that we know now that even at 1.5 degrees, we will start to at least have a decrease in global GDP of 3%. And that it's 3 degrees, which for the moment, the pattern is that we're going to surpass 1.5, as Zoe said. We already also, by the way, have had 4 or 5 episodes of going above 1.5 degrees just this year, that actually we could be up to 10% loss of GDP. So for me, and for those of us who understand that global well-being is declining, which is what is happening because of these elephants in the room, the fact that that gap is so big between the rich and the poor, the fact that actually GDP growth plus population growth plus climate change, because remember GDP growth has been on the back of an extractive economy that's taken our natural resources, that's had an impact, that's actually reduced well-being across the globe, and mostly in the global north, not necessarily in the global south. And that has actually created high social tension. Are you also getting an echo? Because I'm getting an echo too. So should I go back here? I'm not quite sure where I should go. Am I okay? Okay. And that's really problematic. And that is the core of what we wanted to unpack in Earth for All. In particular also because we were starting to go out to G20 citizens and seeing that G20 citizens are asking for a well-being economy. They're asking for something different because they realize that the economy is not servicing their needs. So enhancing well-being and shifting beyond GDP is very much based on these key points. There are a series of different new economic models that we can address and that can really lead us to moving beyond GDP. You've got the well-being economics, where Catherine Trebeck has been so involved. Mission economies, Mariana Mazzucato and a lot of her work, or Kate Rayworth and donut economics. But what all of these different models show is that first you have to take into account social and environmental risk, especially in financial and economic decision making. Secondly, you need to correct the inequity, both between low and high income countries, but also within country. Between the low and high income countries, we're starting to see initiatives called the Bridgetown Initiative, which has been led actually by Mia Mottley of Barbados, where she and other heads of state are starting to think through debt cancellation, special drawing rights, and a real shift in the global south and how they can actually have that space, that economic space, to truly put in place a just transition, which they don't right now because they're asphyxiated by debt and trade deficits. But also the perspective of public goods, which are socializing the rewards of environmental and social commons, and really placing, obviously, a value on externalities and taxing negative externalities, and then increasing the agency of women and workers, but also, as I said, addressing that elephant in the room. The fact that high GDP is going to start to go down, that GDP will actually be something that we now need to buffer with other indicators to really measure a real economy that's serving people, planet, and prosperity at the same time. So this is the reflection that we actually went through. This is the passage from the limits to growth, bringing in planetary boundaries science. Johan Rockström, one of my co-authors at Earth for All, who actually has put forward the planetary boundary science and has already indicated with other scientists that we, of the 9 planetary boundary sciences, planetary boundaries, are already stepping outside of 6. But also that when we created Earth for All, what we wanted to do was make sure that we could actually plug that in to what that means for the SDGs. Knowing full well that, Zoe, you mentioned the UNFCCC, but also the UN in general, we needed to figure out how we could still also work with countries to meet SDGs. And what did that look like? So what it looked like was starting to narrow down the possibility of getting a well-being economy within the planetary boundaries based on 5 key turnarounds, which has already been mentioned. Those turnarounds being poverty alleviation, the empowerment of women and girls, especially in the global south, inequality alleviation, food and energy, systems shifts, which are the underbelly of that change. And this is what one of the plots, one of the, what we call the spaghetti, looks like in terms of the interrelationship between the social and environmental tipping points, the key impacts, shifting from top left-hand corner, for example, population growth, and the possibility of GDP per person. And again, you can buffer that with new indicators, but going all the way down to what does that mean in terms of public spending per person? And the middle around labor cost, labor use, unemployment, but also, very importantly, addressing social trust. And what we realized, and this was a big aha moment for all of us, that actually the speed of action on the planetary boundaries is directly linked to the speed of action on inequality and poverty. And for a climatologist, especially like Johan Rockström, who spent his entire life now recently talking about the planetary boundaries, for him this was a little bit of a shock. Like, okay, I'm not a social scientist. All of a sudden I'm realizing that this aspect, understanding how we enable an economy that services people within the boundaries of the planet, is now our key objective. So that is what was the core thinking with regard to Earth for All. This is what led us then to these 2 key scenarios. The business as usual scenario, which is the too little too late scenario, which you see up top, which is the red, and you'll see in our graphs. Shifting to what we call the giant leap, putting in place those 5 key turnarounds. And what's interesting is you can't just work on the food system and the energy system, which, by the way, is what most governments are focusing on. And they think that's enough. Let's just decarbonize our energy system and our food system, without thinking through what that means for people and the inequality and the poverty elements. And you can't do that both from a national level or a regional level or an international level. Because again, the feedback loops and the way in which our economies are so tied to each other, you need to think about this at the international level as well as at the national level. But what's interesting is that everybody always says to us, the cost of the transition. No, come on, it's too costly. Well, first of all, they both say it's too costly and they say it's impossible. And I always reply, well, if you look at each other today and you think 2 years ago, 3 years ago, we looked at each other and we all were wearing masks. We looked at each other and we were all asking each other how many vaccines we had. How many of us would have thought that, first of all, we would have had such an incredible pandemic? Secondly, that we would all be living through COVID, what we lived through, staying home, being locked down, etc. Well, the transition, the transformation within COVID was feasible, and it happened. And we should tap into the subconscious of that, not just because the transformation was feasible for the wrong reasons, but also because we went back to what was most important. We valued each other, or we were scared of each other, but at least there was a sense of solidarity. there was a sense of collective action from our governments where they were servicing everyone, not just the wealthiest. Again, that was not a perfect scenario. Inequality, et cetera, did rise in certain countries. And we also saw that some countries could not get access to vaccines. But the fact of the matter is that transformation did happen. And that, in our case, when we costed it, would only cost 2 to 4% of GDP. 2 to 4% of GDP, which is pretty much part of the global military budget today. Now, what's important is that each of these different turnarounds has some very key policy recommendations. And this is the overview of each of those recommendations. And I'm not going to go into the detail because I've just been told that I only have 5 minutes. But I will quickly show you these. If you shift from the business as usual scenario into the giant leap, you will see from these different charts that actually the red, which is the business as usual, too little, too late, only continues to go up because you're not taking into consideration on the left hand, for example, inequality, or on the right hand, poverty. And what's interesting is Catherine and I were just talking about that poverty slide. And if you look at the fact that actually, even in the too little, too late, poverty starts to go down, the real dire fact is because people start to die. Because that's the scenario, right? If we do not take care of inequality and poverty and decarbonize at the same time, we know that we are creating a world that is uninhabitable, unlivable for most of us. But I do also want to show this, which is very important because this is also the reality check. How do we actually shift from the immorality? This is not even just the inequality curve. For me, this is called the immorality curve. I'm sorry, how can we say it's okay for CEOs in the United States to now get packages which have grown since 1978 by 1,400%, whereas employee salaries have grown by 18%, and also inflation by about 30%. Again, this is not about communism. This is about having some kind of egalitarianism or equilibrium where we have a proper type of wealth distribution. Because we have to go away from what we call rentierism. We have to go away from the new rentier capitalism, which is so focused on money and not focused on an economy that is servicing people and people's lives as well as within the planetary boundaries, taking into consideration the externalities that we have to truly fundamentally integrate into our economy. Because this is the way we need to start to think about redrawing the game board. Coming in and setting up citizen funds to redistribute that wealth. And by the way, again, people are saying, well, how do you do that through a universal basic dividend? Well, we've seen it done in Norway. We've seen it done in other places across the globe where actually you start to place a tax either on wealth or on the global commons, which you then redistribute. There are also ways that you can take away subsidies on, for example, the wrong things. In Europe, we have the highest subsidies on industrial agriculture, and shift them to the right things, like regenerative agriculture or large-scale sustainable agriculture. You reform the international financial system, and you put in place new progress indicators, which the well-being economies have done. For example, in New Zealand, now there is also some talk in Brazil, but we also have many others who are looking at buffering GDP with new indicators, which place a value on education, access to social services, etc. And that's how you actually start to achieve well-being. At a time when we know it's going to get more and more complex, because we will have increasingly more impacts from an environmental perspective. But we know that if we start to place a value on the right things, as we did through Earth for All, that curve, the giant leap, enables us actually to increase well-being, whereas the too little, too late scenario decreases. It's also how you reduce social tension. And let us remember that growing social tension does not give us the political space to act for most people. It's what we're starting to see in terms of the populism that's growing, the fear-mongering, and the way in which we're capturing the fear of people and their anger and their frustration with governments, which is then stopping us from being able to act. This is what we call the critical feedback loop. Understanding then that social tension will grow if we don't have proper public action. That we need to understand when we look at food and energy shifts, that we bring people on the journey, and that we address the level of inequality and poverty. I only have a few more slides, Catherine. It's very good. She's keeping me on track, and she did say that she would do this. Lastly, just a couple of slides. We didn't want to go out with these recommendations and be looked at as if we were totally nuts. Because most of you are saying, yeah, this sounds really good, but does it really reflect either what people want or what governments want? On the fact of people, we went out and we've done now 2 subsequent surveys. And we've taken in particular G20 citizens. And we've asked them, what do you think about social, environmental tipping points, well-being? And across the board, most of them, we've had pretty much 70% acceptance that we need change, that we need to honor democracy, that we need to take immediate action, and we need it now in order to reduce carbon emissions, even though, again, the radical right and the radical left are telling us that this is not what people want. That even our Earth for All scenarios and all the different offerings, free affordable health care, or at least affordable health care, strengthening workers' rights, investing in renewable energy. And by the way, we don't just throw out these terms. We then give subsequent policy recommendations that underpin every single one of our proposals, whether it be in the Global South or it be in the Global North. But again, the majority of citizens are saying, yes, this is what we need. Whoop. Okay, was I just told that I cannot actually show that slide? Well, this is the last slide. Are you sure it wasn't you, Catherine? Maybe just to say, again, so that you understand that we've tried really hard to work with policymakers, with citizens, on making this not only feasible and viable, but a real possibility. So Zoe, that's coming back to, yes, these are real proposals. There is a live conversation on indicators in many different institutions, and we are constantly working on that. Also to simplify the indicators. There's a live conversation on new taxation, whether it be wealth taxation or windfall profit taxation. There's a live conversation at the IMF and the World Bank on looking at how we renew the Bretton Woods institutions and think about debt cancellation and special drawing rights. And we're actively involved in all of these different conversations. But also, most importantly, what we didn't think at all. Our book's been translated in 10 languages, including in Chinese. We have governments from across the globe asking us to work with them to undertake system dynamic modeling in national contexts. We've been contacted by C40, which is the group of cities, as well as other city associations, to see how we can integrate this at the city level. We've got citizens who are setting book clubs. We've got other citizens that are telling us they want to have citizen assemblies, which are also part of this. This is turning into not just a book, but a movement. And that, for us, has been the greatest sign that we're on to the right thing. It's not perfect. We're going to have a lot of difficult conversations, but hopefully it can give some level of hope for how we can stay within the planetary boundaries and create an Earth for all. Thank you. Do you want me to sit here? Okay.
That was amazing. Thank you. So we're going to have a little panel discussion now. And the reason that Catherine was keeping Sandrine to time was to ensure that we have Q&A from all of you. So I'm sure you've got lots of questions. I'm a huge fan of the democratic right of the audience to get involved in the conversation. So reward me. So jot down your questions, whatever you've got. We're going to have a little conversation up here, and then we'll come to you as well. So we've got a wonderful panel here. My friend and colleague Warwick Smith here, who works at the Centre for Policy Development with me. Warwick is our Wellbeing Economy Research Director. He's an economist and ecologist and does lots of very cool things in Castlemaine where he lives. Sharan, Burrow AC, we're delighted to have you on the panel. Sharan is a sort of a lifelong advocate of human rights issues, of climate action, just transition. Of course, Sharan was for a decade the General Secretary, or the President rather, of the Australian Council on Trade Unions, ACTU, and then most recently for a decade has been the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation. So it's really wonderful to have you back in the country. We've both spent almost 2 decades overseas, and it's lovely to have someone of your stature back in the country. So look, we're going to have a brief conversation to pull apart some of those amazing themes. Thank you, Sandrine. It was amazing. I really love the way that you were able to bring together how reducing social tension is a part of climate action, a part of taking action on poverty. You sort of said at the end there, does it reflect what people want, and does it reflect what governments want? So I might come to you on the government piece, because I think you talked about the people piece. But I mean, how do we kind of build the broad support for One Giant Leap so that governments actually will act on this, and that this agenda can survive election cycles?
So I think that...
That is off. It's just something to do with you, but it sounds worse here than up there.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I spoke to them, but it actually doesn't sound...
Maybe I should put my scarf back on? Is that what you're saying? Yeah, that's a good idea, actually. I think that part is, and we were talking about this afternoon, we need to not only give governments the evidence, but now beyond the evidence, because we've seen how climate denialism has actually grown, even though we have enough scientific evidence to demonstrate that climate change is here. We have to work with governments to build the narratives that will bring people on the journey. And that means really thinking through what is frightening people? What is actually making it so that so many people are voting for governments that are actually either on the radical right or the radical left, or are not really treating the issues that we would think they would care about? And there's been such a manipulation of the narrative that we need to bring that narrative back. Part of that is contextual. So for example, I wouldn't say the same thing to a European government, although the basics are there. Like one, we have to go beyond GDP, especially if we know that GDP is in any case going to go down at the global level. But I think the other is, how do you really think through with governments and be strategic, all of us who are working in this space, on the key issues that are really creating people's lives and livelihoods, either making it more difficult or where they actually hold most dear some of their I would say their family and also their friends, colleagues, etc. How do we enable them to feel comfortable in society and the lives that they're living? And so what we've done is we've put together a series of different storytelling and narratives in order to communication tools in order to work with governments, as well as the really deep social and environmental evidence and economic evidence to give them the bravery. Yep. But there is a caveat to that. And that is that we need to build the capacity of brave leadership overall. And we need to also build the capacity of good leadership. And we're seeing, and this is through apolitical and other big organizations that we're also working with, foundations, that there is a real vacuum in political leadership across the globe. That we're not seeing, first of all, women are not coming forward anymore to be elected, most of them also because we're seeing high statistics of bullying, but also that those people that we would hope, real leadership, those that have foresight and that want to try to fix some of the key problems that we're seeing in society, are no longer wanting to be politicians. And that I find is something that none of us are really prepared for, but I think it's part of the problem. And I don't know if Sharan has some thinking on that, but it is truly problematic.
Yep, no, certainly. If I had $1 for every time people asked me whether I was going into politics, I'd be quite wealthy.
Yeah, me too, actually. I've got the same problem. My husband has said, no way, I'm divorcing you right away if you do that.
Warwick, I might come to you to kind of build on that answer in an Australian context. What do you see as the most important sort of next steps for motivating governments in Australia to kind of adopt this agenda or to take these issues more seriously?
Yeah, sure. I think there's lots of parts of that puzzle, but maybe mention two of them. That, we have a nascent national wellbeing framework in Measuring What Matters launched by the Treasurer and the Australian Treasury, which goes to what Sandrine was talking about earlier about bringing up new measures to complement sort of traditional economic measures, broader measures of what's really important to us. But part of the trouble with that is that, I think probably the majority of Australians don't know that exists. And to make the government bold, we've got to have a demand from the people. And so something that we've been working on and advocating for at CPD is to have a national conversation with the Australian people about the Australia that we want for ourselves and for future generations, and a kind of multimodal, deeper sort of conversation that gets beyond the sort of regular day-to-day, that really gets into the sort of the Australia that we really want. Particularly that future generations lens helps people to imagine what do we really want to leave behind for future generations, and that will bring in social and environmental factors. And so I think that's critically important for multiple reasons. One is to find out what people really want. Another is to build the democratic sort of mandate for, for this sort of wellbeing change that we're talking about, wellbeing economy change. And another is to give politicians the bravery. Because if they know that the people, overwhelming majority of people really want this kind of change, then they're much more likely to step up and make the change. And that national Ipsos poll that Sandrine mentioned, I think 69% of Australians, that was a global poll, Australia was in that poll, 69% of Australians answered yes to questions that were about wellbeing economy. So we already know when you ask them questions about the specific kind of elements of a sort of society and economy that they want, that people do want a wellbeing economy. But I think we need to go on that journey with them so that they have buy-in. And I think the second thing is to celebrate the things that are happening. So I already mentioned Measuring What Matters, the good things that are happening. And when politicians do make a brave step, which I think Jim Chalmers did in publishing his monthly essay and going out on a limb with Measuring What Matters. And I think there's lots of other examples around the country too. The ACT has quite a well-advanced wellbeing framework that, again, I think not many people know about. Even in the ACT, quite a few people don't really know about it. And so, we need to be having those conversations. Here in Victoria, the Department of Treasury and Finance have their early intervention investment framework, which is actually world-leading in the way that they do budgeting and they think about early intervention, and they make sure that we can think beyond those regular sort of election cycles and budget cycles. And so, South Australia has their economic statement. Here, it's sort of scattered throughout the country. There are examples of governments that are doing this kind of work, but I think we need to get behind them, we need to celebrate them, and we need to be talking about those things a bit more.
Yeah, great. So Sharan, maybe I'll bring you in and kind of the just transitions part of all of this. We talk quite a lot about just transitions in Australia. What does that mean to you, and where do you want to see that kind of shift in economic policy making go in Australia?
Well, I think Sandrine and Warwick have both touched on where I would want to go. Our democracies are in trouble. I think Freedom House says less than 20% of people actually live in truly free societies. And if that's the case, and we want to build that brave leadership, not just in politics, but in, all the community leadership that we know matters, then we have to go back to community, because that's where the heart of democratic legitimacy is. If people actually don't want the future that others advocate, then it's not going to fly, and you're going to get this contentious up and down policy cycles. But if people are consistently asking for the sorts of things that You all advocate all of the work you're doing from, climate security, our common future in terms of peace, wellbeing economies, etc. If we're going to do that, then we've got to build again the power of demand from communities. And I mean, some of you are old enough to remember that it took us 3 years to build the Your Rights at Work campaign. And I went from community to community with a lot of incredible people. And we built it from 5 people in a pub to thousands who were on the streets campaigning to get back decent labour laws, and they shifted a government. Now, you could say what happened after that, but same with climate, same with a whole range of things. So Warwick's right, and he lives in a community that's already made decisions about wanting to be, an electric community, wanting to be independent in terms of energy. Going to community and finding out, A, what they want and what's more in common, and connecting those communities is my view about what's at the heart of just transition. But I now have a very radical view about this. It will not come from even where we know what would make a difference. It will not come to be a just transition if we're not courageous enough to build a new generation of social licence, and that means co-creation. It does mean the things that Warwick talked about what people want, and that's a great start. In fact, I'm smiling, Warwick, because a few of us got so annoyed recently that we went to the UN Secretary General. People from very different walks of life, one from business and investment, one from previous government environment, one of my favourite people in the world, Catherine McKenna, and myself, and a warrior from South Africa, Kumi Naidoo, and a few others. And we said we want to build a multi-layered approach to letting people determine what it is. And at the same time, Lawrence Tubiana, who fought alongside of us in the Paris Agreement for not just 1.5, or to keep it alive in those days, but in fact just transition and human rights. She and a great woman that Sandrine and I are friends with in Brazil want to create a permanent deliberative democracy platform so people can have constantly their say. So there's a lot of this parallel thinking is going on, but it's steeped in letting people have a voice, and how you build then that, it's the Indigenous communities language, isn't it? How you build those song lines or connections between communities so that they have a real stake. And I would argue we can only build now social licence if we stop talking about transactional social licence and start talking about co-creation, which is indeed, I think, the heart of just transitions. Now, I could say a lot about who needs to be in community transitions, and I know Amanda and others and Catherine and others working in the next economy are here, and they know my passion for place-based development. It's actually the best chance we've had in generations to get place-based development, which is part of that, but we've all got to want desperately to put people and planet, and that means climate and nature, at the heart of that.
Yeah, thanks. Well said. And it's co-creation is hard and time-consuming, isn't it?
It's painful.
But really, really important. Sandrine, maybe we'll go back to you and your 5 turnarounds. For you, what's the through thread, or what's the way that you bring them all together? I mean, is that around wellbeing economy, wellbeing government? How do you kind of bring them all together, those 5 pillars?
Well, I think the first, which again was a little bit the aha moment, is we realized that we wouldn't actually get to the giant leap with just 1 or 2. So we've done scenarios where we actually only have poverty alleviation only, and of course it's not an only, and empowerment. And we realize that we can't get the giant leap just with poverty alleviation and empowerment. So they really do work together. And what's actually interesting, Andrew, is it plays out in reality. So if you look at, for example, the food system, take Africa, most women don't have land rights. They don't own their own land, but they're 80% of the farmers in Africa, okay? So if you start to look at poverty and inequality alleviation and empowerment of women and the food system, you've pretty much already hit 4 by looking at place-based, going at the community level, having conversations with women, ensuring actually that they're part of your economy, because for the moment they're a parallel economy, they're not even part of the real economy, and developing that system so that it actually hits all 4, and it hits all 4 quite easily. Then you just add energy, because in many cases, in these communities, it's the women who are thinking through, because they're the ones that are working on cook stoves, and both Sharan and I have been involved in the shift within the energy system at the community level, especially in Africa. And you start to bring in low, community level renewable energy that will then enable, first of all, for them to have lighting, which then also enables them to be able to study as girls and boys, brings in education, and in addition enables them to transfer away from cook stoves, where, by the way, kerosene, and there have been so many explosions, there's all kinds of health issues, coal, et cetera, et cetera. So all of a sudden, or wood stoves, you start to realize that actually you've just hit all 5 through one solution. Or take, for example, school-based procurement of regenerative agriculture, where you create schools that are demanding regenerative agriculture. I've seen some schools that are doing both renewable energy plus regenerative agriculture through their procurement. You're also educating kids. So again, all of a sudden, you're starting to hit some of those different, and it sounds so easy when you start talking about it. And this is why I love what Warwick just said, because the Australia we want, or the Belgium we want, or the Zimbabwe we want, is very much linked to all of those. Then what do? You have to visualize it. And we've got the other side that is doing such a good job of scaring us all that this is not possible, it's going to be too costly, that actually it's going to make us all poorer, that et cetera, that somehow we have to create these alternative futures. And that is what this is all about. This is showing that not only is it possible, but actually through these very clear mechanisms, we can start it now, and it will make us also happier and better off. And better off doesn't just mean wealthier. It means bringing us back to the values that truly matter to all of us, because we're saying that life satisfaction is going down, not up. And as I said, well-being is going down, not up. So we have to tap into that, but we do need to show it. And I love this Australia we want. It's, we have to depict what that looks like.
Yep. So, Warwick, you want to build on that then? This Australia we want. How palatable do you think these kinds of messages are for the Australia, sort of the general public in Australia?
Yeah, I personally think that we have a moment right now that's really ready for change. And in fact, I would even say there is going to be change. Because there's a lot of dissatisfaction with how the economy is playing out for people. There's a lot of concern, particularly around housing affordability and the housing crisis and climate change and the cost of living and a lot of other things. And we know that the sort of authoritarian nationalists have a ready playbook to capitalise on this sort of economic disaffection. They blame migrants, they blame the government being too large, the government interference in their lives and in the economy. And those sort of simple lines can work when people aren't well informed about the economy. And I think that's the role we have to play. We have to sort of step into that void with our own solutions to the sort of economic malaise and tell a positive story. It needs to be a relatively straightforward story, but build that narrative that says there is a positive journey from here that's not about closing the borders and blaming the migrants. And I think there's a real readiness for that in the community, but people are disaffected, but they don't really know what the problems are, and I think more importantly, they don't know that there are alternatives to our current economic system. We've had a more or less the same system for about 50 years. And so that's, we need to show that there are alternative ways of doing things to how we currently do, and that, business as usual doesn't have to continue. It doesn't have to be a choice between business as usual and right-wing authoritarianism, actually, that there's a positive change.
Really quickly, because I know Sharan probably wants to add something, but one thing that coming back to this point of there is such a malaise, people can't quite pinpoint what it is, hence why they've been hijacked in terms of the narrative. We have to point out that systems change is fundamental, that we got it wrong. It's not working anymore. The existing systems are not generating well-being for more people. And so here are the potential other systems, the ways in which we can actually move forward, whether it be through new indicators, placing a value where it needs to be, et cetera, et cetera. And there are ways for us to hack that. But I think people don't quite know, why am I feeling this? Why is mental illness going up? Why is suicide going up? Why is this the first generation that's going to make less than its parents? We have to start pointing that out because these systems are not geared to enhance your life. And also, they've been hijacked by over-financialization and shareholder value, which is not coming back to you. So we need to get better at showing why.
Yeah, and that the current system was a result of deliberate decisions.
Yeah.
And that we can remake those decisions. Yep.
One of the issues I wanted to pick up, and Sharan, you can come in on this, or any of you if you'd like, is redistribution of wealth. Always a thorny topic and thorny issue. You know, it's one of your big turnarounds and sort of some of the different slides you've had up there. I mean, how do you, I mean, I'd love to hear more on sort of your ideas around citizens' funds and universal basic dividends, but or at a more general level, you know, how do we get that balance right? You know, most people would say, well, you know, companies should be making some form of profit, right? But or feel free to disagree. But how do we then crack down on the mega profits that you're talking about, which you know clearly aren't ploughing back into society? So I guess that question around redistribution of wealth and how we get that right.
Sharan, you want to start?
No, I'm happy for you.
Yeah, of course you are. Thanks. Just throw that hot potato back in my direction.
No, not at all. But
Kidding.
I mean, you've written about this. I
Yeah.
have very strong views, but you know, we can come to those.
Well, first of all, I mean, I want to say that Sharan was also on our Transformational Economics Commission, and her help in sorting through some of these tricky questions has been really fundamental. But I do think that there's one key truth that we need to unpack, which is that economies that have been more egalitarian have always been more stable. And I think that's really important. So beyond the immorality of where we are today in terms of the wealth distribution, if we're going to get back to bringing more people on the journey, and I gave a speech at Wall Street, and this is a little bit what I said as well, and what Sharan also says, you know, there are no jobs on a dead planet. There are no bonds, no stocks, no possible assets. I mean, if we just keep on milking, and thinking that growing profits are the only future, then we're just crowdfunding disaster. So that is the reality. Before we even get into redistribution, I just really want to make that statement. Because the economy is not servicing people at all. So how do we then create an economy that's fair and that really starts to get back to actually servicing people? Never really serviced planets, so that we need to think through a little bit more. But how do we get back to servicing people? And so the possibility of redistribution actually, in many ways, comes back to getting rid of the existing perversities in the market, which is that we have given too much value on shareholders. Shareholders are the ones that are dictating the economy in most cases. If a company fires anywhere up to 1,000, 10,000, in some cases 20,000 people, shares go up. Now there's something really problematic in that, Andrew. And so how do we start to place a value on employment? How do we start to place a value on the real economy? And the only way to do that is to start looking at indicators. In my sense, number one basic is broaden than just productivity, because then productivity is around profits, which, by the way, again, how is it possible that we gave such ownership to all our natural resources to certain big companies? They don't own most of those resources any more than any of us do, but somehow we allowed that to happen, okay? We are in the mess because we did that. Now, how do we redress the balance? That's when you start to then get into the question around taxation, where you place taxation. It's back into a question of how much is enough in terms of shareholder value. I mean, why is it that we're enabling 2.8 billion profits in oil and gas, windfall profits per day, and it's not taxed? And energy poverty is going up. So these are some of the keys. I mean, a lot of it is how do we bring things back to placing a value on what is important through our economic system indicators, and then how do you start to put in place the right taxation structures that actually tax the right things or the wrong things, but at least put in place tax incentives to enable the right things. And I think that is part of it. Then you can get into thinking around just transition funds, redistribution, but I also think we just need to get back to the fundamentals of the economy, which is not enabling us to actually place the capital where we need it to go in order to get us out of the mess that we've created.
Why don't we go Sharan and then Warwick, yeah.
Well, I mean, I think Warwick touched on some of this anyway about what is it people want. And when you know what people want, and let's face it, we do. If you do the polls, that doesn't mean we can just tell them what they want, and we need to go back to those voices. But if you do the polls over decades, they want health, they want education, they want secure jobs for their kids, they want to be able to ensure that their kids, if they choose, can buy a house with an affordable mortgage. I mean, all of those things that will, come out. And they want action on climate because they can see the destruction. They actually don't like the destruction of nature because, many communities live amongst it and they value it. But if you really think about what's going on, then as a very young union official who helped build the super funds, then it worries me that we got into the trap of not just bringing in enough return over a working lifetime for a dignified retirement income. We somehow lost the 65% at 65 link with the state pension. We have to kind of go back to rethink those things, and of course the inequity for women and those things. But that's only because those funds and many others, the mutuals we've built, now banks, are caught up in this financial system. And it's not that the finance is a bad thing to have built. In fact, I argue that if we need more capital at a community level, let's build it. Where are the cooperatives? Let's go back and build the community wealth. We know how to do it. We've done it traditionally, and not just in Australia, in all parts of the world. I can show you where the poorest of women build income, build collectives and build income. So then what is it that's actually causing this issue? Yes, it is the financial system, but it's sheer greed at the end of the day. And if you think about, we convinced, who's a good woman, despite the Titanic being an impossible thing to turn around, but we can convince the head of the IMF, a whole bunch of us, including the business community, can I say, the progressive business community, to do debt for equity swaps during COVID and as part of the climate transition. And she did all that. Kristalina's a really good person. But guess what? It was the countries who said, oh no, we can't, the donor countries who said, oh no, we don't want to do that. So, increase the SDRs, special drawing rights, allow debt for equity, a whole range of mechanisms. But did they do it? No, they took it for themselves. Now, state treasuries are compromised. But the one thing I wanted to say to you is, I'm kind of shocked. It's not an Australia-only phenomena, but I've been trying to come back for 18 months. I live here now, and I'm gradually extracting myself and doing more work in Australia. But the thing that I've actually talked to business and community groups about, and the unions, is you can't have this dependency on government alone when those very institutions, including business, have stripped government treasuries of their capacity even to provide for essential services. And the latest one that I just burn about, which you must too, is that I hear it in investment conferences where people are talking sustainability and equality. Oh, well, philanthropy has to take the risk, and then governments can crowd in the funding, and then business will come. Private sector investment will come. What? To socialise your profits and privatise your profits and socialise your losses. Yeah, that's a great model. That's not the free market, boys and girls. That's actually something akin to an evil turnaround on socialism. So, we have a lot of work to do to actually see that the capital we've built becomes patient capital or a longer term perspective to fund the startups, to fund community developments, to fund place-based. And on the just transition front, one of the things that now worries me is that in some communities, not enough, but in some communities we've got the recipes for transitioning workers out of fossil fuels pretty okay, where you've got government, employers and the community and the unions all on board. But as we attract new startups, clean energy, manufacturing, mining, whatever it is, we are not allowing the capital on a patient basis to start up what are now small to medium enterprises, but will be big enterprises potentially within 10 to 15 years. So we've got a lot of rethinking to do, but it does start again with who's demanding this from a community perspective and going back to that place and really listening to people and building their demands, and then we can start to actually vote your pension or vote for your treasury or whatever.
Brilliant. Now, I know you want to say something. It's your turn now. So we've got a microphone on either side of the room. We're going to try and take 2 or 3 questions at a time. So please put up your hand. Now, while you're putting up your hands, Warwick, you just had a little comment you wanted to get in.
I did, and I'll keep it short.
Put your hands up and if we can get a microphone to both, that'd be great. Go on.
I think just again wanted to say that there's a real opportunity in Australia right now to have this conversation about wealth inequality because of the housing crisis. And I think rich and poor alike recognise that the system is a bit broken. When you've got to spend 20 years of your life just saving up the deposit to buy a house, let alone the house itself, we know that things are pretty broken. And we have a sort of economic and taxation system at the moment. We're seeing steady declines in rates of home ownership. And we have a system now which will only facilitate that decline in home ownership and that concentration of home ownership, and nothing at all in place that's capable of turning that trend around. And so we leave that alone for long enough, we end up with 1% of the population owning all of the houses. Sure, that might take a few hundred years, right? Because housing turnover is slow. But that's where we're headed if we don't do something about it.
Can I just add to that quickly?
Equity model.
I did promise.
Yes.
Question.
Let's get a question.
Okay.
And then you definitely will hear from you all, Sandrine. Let's go. Sorry. Here we go.
The ideas are absolutely wonderful, and it doesn't surprise me that 67 and 69% of us want them. But I think we've got 2 problems. One is that the extremely wealthy have a very disproportionate influence on our political system and on the information and disinformation that circulates electorally. Otherwise, I think we wouldn't be getting these nonsensical election results. I think the other problem is that we've got an economic system where if growth, falters, we go into recession, and even more reasonable politicians who might be trying to do the right thing are just going to get voted out. So between the influence of wealthy people and the problems with the actual structuring of the economic system, how can we win?
Yeah.
That's great. We'll just take a couple of questions. Sorry, you're going to have to jot this down. Is that not working over there? So there is someone with a microphone. Oh, it's Cressida. Hello.
So, Sandrine, you said you liked difficult discussions, and I feel a little emboldened. You've talked a lot about indicators and the importance of indicators, but we've had many decades of alternative to GDP indicators, international. We've had indicators, we've had dashboards. Over 2/3 of the OECD countries have wellbeing frameworks, largely in the form of indicators and dashboards. We've got lots and lots of data on climate change. Nothing's happened. It's not like people don't know that there are things that we need to do, but we're not actually taking the right steps. We've got lots and lots of data out there. We know that things are really bad with inequality. I mean, you have presented a huge amount of data that aligns with everything that we know. So what's the plan for how we get indicators to work this time? And is it really more indicators that we need, or is it something else that's actually connecting it to action?
I know. Can we just, Esther, can we have the microphone just down here for Christina? Thank you. Christina, do you mind putting your hand up? Just, well, we've got lots of people online as well.
Thank you, and thank you for a very interesting panel and discussion. I am definitely interested, Sandrine, and indeed from the rest of the panel, that a lot of the conversation rightly does focus on extractive industries and, you know, the kind of food and fibre sector. But if you kind of look at, you know, companies listed by market cap these days, and you look at the top 10, there's a long list of what you would call tech companies in there: Google, Meta, Apple, Amazon, and the list goes on, Berkshire Hathaway, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, etc. Arguably, the hottest thing out there is artificial intelligence, not necessarily driving emissions in the right direction. I'm just interested in the discussions you have in the US with the World Bank and IMF, and you're talking about rebalancing the system. Where do they play a role in that?
Great. All right, so you guys dive in. So we head over here, we've got kind of the wealthy influence, and, you know, governments get voted out if they do bad things. We've got the questions around indicators, and we've got Christina's questions around those industries and extractive industries and others. So, do you want to go first, Sandrine?
Yeah, I think on the first question, so it's not just the economic players, it's also obviously the political players. And as I said, the capacity for real leadership and bravery. We know that part of the problem is also short-term cycles, both in terms of the business side, but also in terms of the policy side. And so there, you know, some people have said, in fact, I've been on a panel before where I was asked to argue in an Oxford type of debate whether authoritarianism was better than democracy. And it does throw us into a real conundrum, because some will argue that China has actually brought the most people out of poverty, out of any economy, and yet all of us know some of the flaws in the Chinese model. But also the Chinese have long-term plans. So I do think that, and this is some of the new radical conversations that are happening around how do we understand from a geopolitical perspective as well, where we need to start adopting different types of models. How do we bring in democratic processes, but by the same token have longer political lifespans with longer term plans? How do you also build up the governance structures so that they're not based just on the leadership? So this is a conversation that we're having, for example, with Catherine, when we look at the well-being economy governments, and many of them have done the right things by putting in place the right indicators, et cetera, and then the leadership changes, and you see that it gets much rockier in terms of continuing with the well-being economy. So there needs to be some real structural shifts. And this is where I still believe that we do need to fundamentally shift the economic model. I actually don't think anything will really happen unless we fundamentally shift the economic model. And I do still believe, and I actually think this is the moment. You know, I would have hoped that it would have been before. I mean, the first big speech that was given around beyond GDP was Bob Kennedy's speech in 1968, you know, where you don't place a value on that really matters. I mean, Jesus Christ. 1968, and here we are. But I think that if we can start to show that, for example, as I showed, we're losing GDP. So really, we can't just measure GDP anymore. Up until now, we kind of could because GDP was growing. But I'm kind of thinking to myself, and I'm thinking out loud with all of you, because these are, you've thrown out all the perfect questions and the doubt about everything that we're saying. Because yes, there are big mammoths out there that don't want this to work. But if you start to face the reality that actually GDP is decreasing and will continue to decrease, I think we have more of a case now to say you've got to create other economic buffers. So that's one possible scenario. It's not perfect, and it still has some element of hope in it, that people will be rational, and that actually governments will think that the well-being of more people is more important than just their own individual well-being, and also the well-being of the power mongers. The other is, in the US, for example, I mean, we know that 40 hours a week of the US members of Congress is spent on lobbying. So one way to hack the system is change the lobbying laws, which of course we've tried to do forever, but still has to be done. So where are those levers for change where actually you can start to have some leverage? That's another one. Because actually we know that the US is a false democracy these days. It is. And then I think and so I'm trying to go through all the different questions quickly. One on the indicators, by the way, let's not have thousands. We've got far too many. We're going to have to start to limit it. In Europe, we've now been talking about GDP plus 3, but then how do you also just pick indicators? And I know with Catherine would be so much better involved in this conversation even than myself. But I do think this is the time to really think about what then are those indicators. And through the well-being economy governments, they've been giving a lot of thought to that. And we need to exchange that knowledge. On the extractive industries and the tech companies, yeah, it's clear that the tech companies have a huge footprint and that the tech companies are part of the problem. By the way, on housing as well, if you look at the entire San Francisco Bay Area, the housing market has been destroyed by the tech companies. You can pinpoint it directly because it's been impossible for anyone that doesn't work in a tech company to afford a house or to rent, etc. So how do we start to call them out? You know, they're all very happily setting up foundations. And as I say, purchasing wings in different departments across Stanford University, Harvard, and MIT to make them feel better because they're all tax write-offs. But we need to start calling some of this out. So the responsibility of the tech companies is fundamental, both in terms of their emissions, but also in the way in which they're playing with the economy. And then, of course, the really dangerous conversation is around AI and what we do about AI for good and technology for good, because right now it's really only for profit. So these aren't necessarily answers. I think all of these questions point out the complexity of where we are. Does that mean we don't continue to try? No, we have no choice. So yes, it's been a long time on a lot of these questions, but we need to keep on out strategizing and thinking through in the way in which we bring forward evidence, data, hold different governments accountable, think through the policy, the long-termism of it, et cetera, et cetera.
But if you ask me one thing that I would want to wave a magic wand around, it's disinformation and misinformation.
Yeah.
And it isn't just elections. This is every day in our media. You know, there is no truth-telling in media. There's no fit and proper person status that gets you debarred or de-licensed or whatever. There's no regulator that actually calls out and sanctions the fact that people just make shit up. You know, seriously. And that's a technical term. You know, you listen to some of it, and I suppose it's because Australia's smaller, and we know this is a problem globally. But, you know, Murdoch's globalised it, but it isn't just Murdoch. But when you can build celebrity, you know, on the back of making people like Viktor Orban, who's destroyed democracy in Hungary, a poster child for Fox News, then...
Or Trump, for that matter.
Or Trump. But when you look here and see it every day, you just think, oh my God. So, absolutely. The other thing I'd say is the GDP plus whatever, it's called the social contract. Again, go back to the community and to the workers and to say what is it that is the social contract that's at the heart of democratic legitimacy, full stop. And yes, the union movement internationally did this work, but it doesn't matter who does it. It's actually what is it that people want, that we build our economies and our governance systems around. And I would have a simple answer. Well, actually, I've got a challenge. Why the hell are governments actually inviting big data centres to locate and not demanding they bring their own energy investment? I mean, there's nothing to stop them building renewables to service their data needs and actually freeing up the grid for energy security for people. But on the global system, I'd say the IMF and the World Bank, and I say to you with all, sincerity, the leaders, people like RJ, Kristalina, Ngozi, they're fellow travellers of ours, and they went in to try and make a difference, but it's broken. It's just broken.
So Warwick, do you want to have a quick go? And then I know we've got, we'll do one last round of questions. So I can see a couple of hands already. But get your hands up and we'll do one last round. Warwick.
I'll have a quick go at answering all three of the questions in one answer. It could be a train wreck, but let's see how we go. I think in terms of the sort of power of vested interests over government, the answer in my mind is more democracy.
Real democracy.
And deeper
Real
democracy. If we're not talking about just turning up every 3 years and casting a vote,
Yeah.
but citizens' assemblies
Yeah.
and public education and real investment in public education and reaching out to people about what the issues are and informing voters and that's democracy involved in the decisions that affect them. And we've got Tom here from Think Forward. There's a little organisation that's going out to people, to young people, to teach them about the economy, to make them economically literate. And I think those sorts of initiatives are really critically important. And I think at the same time, democracy is very closely related to industrial relations and to worker power. And I think we really got to invigorate our unions. We've got to sort of rebuild them. We're sort of in the position we're in because worker power is so weak. I think, is a big explanation for why we're in the situation we're in. And I think that, again, goes to the AI issue. AI has great potential to give us a 4-day work week, to give us 6-hour work days, if we could use those productivity gains for public purpose. But the trajectory we're on is not that trajectory. The trajectory we're on is for those private companies to capture all of those benefits and to keep us working as hard as we can. So again, that's about the democratic process and the democratic decisions we make informed about that future.
Great. So we've got one lady who's yes, and then a gentleman at the back. Thanks, Esther. And then Harriet. Yeah, great. Is anyone else? This is kind of your last chance. There might be time for one other question. Yeah, great. Okay, good. Yeah, let's go for it, please.
Yeah, really liked all your ideas and support the thoughts that you have, but I'm just sort of aware that a whole lot of our surplus funds as a country go into the military machine. And I think that happens in many countries. And I think that money could be much, much better spent on all the wonderful ideas that you have. So I'm just wondering how we can shrink the military machine. And maybe it's about creating an aggressivity index or something so that people are aware of how much of our money is spent in that way. And how we can control ourselves to not be so aggressive, warfaring, and generally undermining our planet in a whole other way than what you've been talking about today, but which is costly. And it's costing us way too much, and I'd rather that money was spent on what you were saying.
Thank you very much. Let's go to the gentleman at the back. Yep.
Hello, Sandrine.
Can we just pass the microphone back? Sorry.
I hope you can hear me, or I can speak without microphone.
You need. Yeah.
Working.
You need to speak into it because we've got people online.
Hello?
Yep.
Yes.
Jordan Panayotov, Independent Center for Analysis and Research of Economies. Given that all policies and investments have social impacts which are differential, and ultimately all those social impacts are impacts on well-being of whole population, then the question is, how do we judge for causality for social impacts, which is absolutely crucial in order to design policies and investments that will work in order to improve well-being of whole population. So that's it.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Harriet, just there. You're almost there, Katie. Thanks.
No?
How would I know?
Seems to go on and off.
Hold it
actually.
close.
Just yell into it, Harriet.
I can yell, can I?
There you go.
Okay, thanks. I wanted to pick up something you said before, Warwick, and that was around narrative. And there was optimism and things that you were saying. I'm not feeling very optimistic today or this week, but maybe in a couple of weeks, next week, who knows. The forces that are benefiting substantially from the status quo, the top 1%, have managed to somehow convince huge populations that their message is in the public interest. Their private interest is in fact the public interest. What is that narrative shift? Like, what is the message that might be able to shift us away from this trajectory that we're on right now in the world, where the most powerful, rich people in the world are telling whole populations that what they say is needed is what they need?
Great. And then Jackie, last question. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the talk. And actually, your question is very much like mine. It's about the story. 50 years, the story's been the same. That 2 generations have grown up thinking this is the way the world is. What's happened to our universities in teaching economics and understanding alternatives? We've had lists and lists of top eminent economists saying a carbon tax is the only sensible solution. What economists say doesn't even matter anymore. The powerful forces that spin the narrative that this corporatized affluence is good for everyone. This is the question: how do we change a story that 95% of the population believe is true, when the evidence is all to the contrary?
Well, the good news is, guys, we can answer all those questions in 4 minutes. So you got 90 seconds each. Sandrine, go for it.
Oh, God. Well, one on the military machine. There's been a big movement around how do you recreate positive peace. I totally agree with you. First, as I said, you just deviate some of those defense funds and you can start to invest. But it is a machine. And it comes back to the powerful, the most powerful, that are using that machine as a way to funnel their money. I think that, again, if we come back to some level of democratic process, we're going to have to start protesting. You know, people are going to, we saw it during the nuclear anti-nuke movement, we saw it during Vietnam, we actually saw, and we can't forget that a lot of the conversation we're having today is thanks to the incredible bravery of the young women and girls that went out alongside Greta. Even now that Greta is being ridiculed, the fact is they really did bring back climate change into prominence and forced us to think. And now we're backtracking. And let's remember, part of the reason why there is this feeling of despair and the backtracking is because those in power started to feel the pain. And so they're fighting back. And they're fighting back at this time, and so we're now all starting to get super worried, but we can't give in. We have to fight back too. Now, what does that mean, fighting back? Fighting back means, and this is a little bit what we talked about today, actually, some of us, how do you fight fire with fire? How do you then outsmart some of that disinformation which is being created? How do you create those new narratives? How do you get into social media and use AI and use social media in the same way that it's being used against us for that narrative? How do you talk to media, the good media, and get them to come out and start telling these stories in a different way. There is something to be said both about the reality check, but also the good storytelling. How do you create that ecosystem of change where communities are thinking, hey, I want to be part of that cool club that are doing the right thing, both in terms of businesses, but also in terms of communities. So I think that's important. On universities, we're working hard, many of us, on getting back to universities. First of all, getting out of neoliberal economics and starting to tell the story of new economics. What does that actually look like? We know that most youth don't want to work for businesses that are only thinking about profit and are actually creating the problem. They want to be the heroes. So how do we prop them up? How do we enable them to be able to do that, both through universities, but also in terms of ensuring that we give those good stories of governments and companies that are doing the right thing. By the way, we need them to go into government too, not just companies, because we're having a brain drain in terms of people who want to work for government. I'll maybe leave it at that. But I do think maybe the last point around how you plan for social impact that was asked for by the gentleman. I mean, we definitely need to take into consideration that social tipping points are now greater than environmental tipping points. Because of this misinformation, because of real economics, the housing crisis, the fact that actually people, and especially the next generation, is feeling the pain, it has to be built in to everything that we do. And that comes back to the social contract that Sharan was talking about.
I think I can do it in 3 words. You all know my history. And to all 4 questions, organise, organise, organise.
There you go, Sharan.
And I would add to what Sandrine said about, you know, using the tools of social media and so on, and go for the opposite side of it, which is we need to get into communities and be talking to people and connecting communities and rebuilding community in places. And, you know, we're working hard on that ourselves in Castlemaine, Central Victoria, on Jara country, where we've started a cooperative that's going to buy local real estate and take it permanently out of the market and manage it for the community. And I think that's where the traction is actually in conversations between real people in communities, place-based work. And it's hard and it's resource intensive, but I actually don't really see another alternative. You know, and it's part of that, it's part of the democratic process.
Yeah, completely. Right. And I think we all need to build on all of this, because you need it at all levels.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. Look, we've come to the end of the time on our stage, but Sandrine will be here for a little while until she gets whisked to her next event, so feel free to come down and say hello. But this has been wonderful. Thank you. We've traversed a huge amount of content tonight, and I think looked at kind of the challenges and the opportunities. So please join me in thanking Sandrine and Sharan and Warwick. Thank you.